David Blume.
Well, let's see, make sure everybody can hear. We've got quite a large room today. Those folks in the back, can you hear me okay? Just fine? Good. Well, let's see. I'll say a few things about myself, and I'm going to depart from my usual way of getting into things because this is a peak oil group, and I noticed a lot of people are not part of the every week thing and might need a little background on what peak oil is. So I'll keep that brief because some of you already do know quite a bit about that. I first learned about alcohol when I was in college about 1 million years ago. And I had a particularly good ecology teacher who would lie to the students with a straight face just to see if he could get away with it. And we were looking at this bottle of fermenting beer on the table, and he said, "That stuff would run your car." And I took one look at him and I said, "You're a liar." He said, "Prove it." Well, I went off to the library, and I came back with a stack of books like this, all about the use of alcohol in vehicles, going way, way back, and I'll tell you about some of that history. So anyway, it blew my mind that I'd never heard of this before. This was just unbelievable that we could be educated in this country and not know what fueled the second most expensive thing we own after a house. And that set me on a whole trajectory where I ended up teaching workshops some years later when we had the Arab oil embargoes. And I see enough people with gray hair here so you'll remember that. For those of you who weren't there, because you were still pretty young, we actually had to stand in line to get gasoline, sometimes 2 or 3 hours, because it was rationed, and we had to, wait our turn. And, we haven't had to do that since 1979 or 1980. But we might start seeing some of that happen again. And so a little bit of what I'll be talking about is what we can do to avoid that happening. I also have an extensive background in farming. And I operated a community-supported agriculture teaching farm in the San Francisco Bay Area on 2 acres, one of which was on a 45-degree slope. And we fed 450 people from those 2 acres. We did that with a system called permaculture, which I'll be referring to several times tonight, but I'm not going to go too far into what permaculture is because it's a whole 2-week course in itself. But you'll see, when you see what we're talking about tonight in terms of integrating different parts of farming and energy together, this is the way we think of things in permaculture, and I'll try to point some of those out as we go along. Well, people have pretty much stopped showing up, so let's do a little list making here. I never come with a talk that is pre-canned, so what I want to know, because I can talk about alcohol for 8 hours straight and then tell you to come back tomorrow for another 8 hours, and we don't have that long. So what I'd like to do is find out what you want to know about alcohol fuel, what things you've heard that you want cleared up, and we'll just start off with a list of questions from you. And don't worry, these won't be the only questions you can ask. You can ask them any time during the talk. Because if you have a question, so do 6 other people have the same question. So I'm totally there for you to go back and forth with me on questions. But let's get an initial list so I know where to start, which you can ask. Okay. All right. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about peak oil first before we really get into alcohol fuel. When we talk about oil is the thing that happened once in the history of the planet. We had huge inland seas that were full of algae that died and went to the bottom and was huge layers of the stuff. And over time it got buried under soil and it got deeper and deeper until the pressure converted that algae into oil. Not dinosaurs, none of that, algae. Okay, so that happened at one point in history. And in fact, if you keep putting too much pressure on this stuff that turns into oil, where you've got like 15,000 feet of soil above, like with changes in geology, it won't even stay as oil anymore. It'll all turn to natural gas. So basically, if you put under enough pressure, oil will continue to break down and will become natural gas. Smaller amounts of natural gas are always found in oil anyway, even at different depths. Because when oil comes up out of the ground, it practically fizzes in many cases with all the gas that's in it. So peak oil, this stuff was made once in history. It's never going to be made again. And at some point, we're going to run out. That is not today. We are not going to run out of oil today. It's not going to happen one day where suddenly we don't have oil. And in fact, I would argue that we will never run out of oil. We may run out of money to pay for oil. It may get pretty scarce and, we may not have access to it like we do now. But just like anything, just like mushrooms in the forest, you keep picking them and you keep picking them. The ones you got to go farther to get, you sell for more because it's more work, and at some point it's not worth going any further in the forest to get the mushrooms. And that will eventually happen with oil. But long before that time, there's a key moment at which the demand for oil keeps going up and the ability to produce more oil stops and starts to go down no matter what you think you can do about it. Because, quite frankly, we've been very good at finding oil for the last 100 years, and we've done a really good job at tapping into most of it. So we have basically at this point reached the halfway point. And we're on the plateau now. We're starting to go down the other side. Now, you'll hear a lot of debate about this. Is it 5 years from now? Is it 10 years from now? Is it 50 years from now? Or has it already happened? I'm going to give you a little different definition of peak oil because I think it's more valid. I'm going to give you the functional definition of peak oil. Are we going to have more oil the following year than the year before? And I'm going to argue that we've already hit that point. Not because it isn't possible to squeeze a little more oil out of the ground, but there are many things that limit how much oil we're going to get out from here on out. And I'll give you as evidence of that a little-known incident that happened in November 2003. OPEC had a meeting, and they said, let's just see what happens if we cut back production 3%. Now, OPEC's about a third of the world's oil, so that's like a 1% drop in production. And they did that. They stood back and waited to see who was going to pick up the money on the table, who was going to increase their production, and take that part of the market that they were leaving out. No one could. They said, well, that's odd. Maybe some refineries are down for repairs, or maybe there's a labor strike, or who knows what, but maybe it's just a fluke. So in February 2004, they dropped the production of oil by 10%. And they were sure this was going to get some action, because that's 3% of the world's supply. And they left that money on the table, and no one could pick it up. No oil could be produced to replace that was no longer available. So I would argue with anyone at this point that that's proof positive that we're already at peak oil, that we cannot, even when the money is on the table, get more oil so that we can sell it. And what happens when we hit peak oil there's a lot of debate about that. We're going to cover some of that. But it's not an overnight situation. It doesn't suddenly change overnight because, we've drifted into this, as I've just argued, over the last 3 years. And yet, the first real sign that we're having in the United States that there's a problem is with the prices. Okay? And we'll drop in on some of the reasons why that's happening. But it basically is the beginning salvo of the whole, what happens when oil starts to plateau and then drop off. Now, Exxon, of course, is not likely to give you a pessimistic evaluation of oil, but they did a study in 2005 where they looked at the future of oil. That was 2010 out here, 2005 right here, 2000 and out here. I'm just going to do a little off scale, 2050. So the way their chart looks of oil production, it looks like it comes up, starts to flatten out about 2005, and at 2010 it starts to go down. Okay, so this is Exxon's definition of peak oil. They figure we got about 5 years. Now, the demand for oil is expected to do this. And what Exxon says is all of this will be having to come from OPEC. And that isn't possible. In fact, Saudi Arabia just a week ago said, we're going to have 8% oil less each year from now on. We've kind of tapped out. And maybe if we spend billions of dollars, we can cut the rate of depletion to maybe 2%. But that's the best we can do. This would require OPEC to increase production by over 15%. and it's not possible. Okay, it's already been said. So, but I want to tell you a little bit about this line, because, there's lies, damn lies, and then there's statistics. This line had a very interesting label when I looked at the study. It said petroleum, and the other thing it had underneath it was NGC, and it had TS. So this is very interesting. So this line is not just petroleum, it's these other things here. So what are these other things? NGC is natural gas condensates. So there's nasty stuff in natural gas, cyclohexane, cyclobutane, cyclobenzene. These are really nasty chemicals. You can't really send it to people's homes and have it burn in the house because it's carcinogenic and pretty nasty. So they condense these out of the natural gas into a liquid by basically chilling the natural gas briefly. And they're taking that liquid and they put it in the gasoline to get rid of it, because there's nowhere to get rid of it legally, otherwise it's toxic waste. And so now a percentage of this line is actually natural gas condensates. Now, the other thing, the TS is tar sands. How many people have heard about tar sands? Well, this is a very well-educated group then, because it's usually I get 3 hands. So in Canada turns out to be one of our major sources of oil right now, and it's not petroleum. It's tar, something called kerogen. So they basically dig up this tarry, sandy deposit, and they hit it with a lot of steam and a few other processes, and they melt the tar out of it, and then it has to go through several refining processes to be made into crude oil, which it then can go and be refined into all kinds of other things. But it's a precursor to petroleum. It's not petroleum. And that turns out to be actually another pretty big slice of this. So when you start taking out things that are not petroleum, and you're looking at 2005, we've already crossed the peak. So the only reason why they can push it to 2010 is they've changed the way they're accounting for oil by including other things. So you may think it's a technical definition, but I'll tell you, when it talks about oil itself going away, it's already started to happen. Now, it's going to happen slowly, and then it's going to pick up speed. And the reasons why it's going to pick up speed have to do with population. As people start to continue to reproduce and countries get bigger, they use energy. And the demand, as you saw, will keep going up. So we have to already 25 years ago, should have been working on ways of powering the world that didn't completely rely on petroleum. Quick question. Let's get into alcohol fuel. Quick question.
What's the growth rate of petroleum demand right now?
I don't have that figure memorized, but when you look at the expected new car registrations and new truck registrations, you're looking at a doubling to tripling of the current fleet by about 2025, primarily due to China and India. So how much fuel that represents is not completely clear.
Can I say something quickly?
Yeah.
I read about 20 years ago in Scientific American that there's supposedly like centuries of coal in different parts of the world.
Okay, so he's mentioning that there's a lot of coal in the world. Coal is not petroleum, and it's not as useful, and it's also a limited material that someday will run out.
Precursor, isn't it?
It actually, for 25 years, they've been trying to make gasoline out of coal, and they can't do it.
Okay, I just wondered.
They've been trying that forever.
Are there significant untapped resources in China and Russia that haven't been gone after?
He's asking, are there big untapped resources that we don't know about? The answer is no. Nobody's found a supergiant field in a couple of decades, and even giant or smaller fields aren't common or hardly anymore. In fact, the Anwar National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska would only extend the world supply of oil a few days if you could pump it all at once, which of course you can't. So, we're talking about a pretty fearsome amount of fuel we use. Just gasoline alone, we're looking at 160 billion gallons a year. And this number is going to come up a lot in what we talk about. So that's what we got to replace if we're going to replace oil. There's a lot of reasons to replace oil, but let's talk a little bit about history. Alcohol was a very popular fuel in the United States in the 1800s, before cars were ever invented. We produced millions of gallons of alcohol for lighting homes and street lighting and for some for heating. Alcohol lamps were the standard way people lit their homes in the 1800s. It was alcohol with a little bit of turpentine in it, which you can tap from trees just like maple syrup. And that gave it a nice bright light. And it was a very clean burning fuel. The other things people used were animal fat or beeswax for light. And, those are a little less clean. They make soot, etc. Later on, kerosene came into existence with the discovery of oil, and it replaced alcohol because it was cheaper to produce, but of course it was nowhere near as clean. History books always talk about we went somewhere from animal fat candles to petroleum in one step, and that wasn't true. The city of Cincinnati used to grind and ferment 12,000 bushels a day of corn just for streetlights, to make alcohol for streetlights. So we have a long history of making alcohol here. When it comes to the internal combustion engine, the first one that was used in an automobile was by a guy named Nicholas Otto, and that's not A-U-T-O, that's O-T-T-O. And he used alcohol as his fuel in the first internal combustion engine car. Internal combustion engines have been around longer and used in industrial settings like in mines, etc., and they use coal gas and that kind of stuff. But when it was first used as a vehicle, alcohol was the only fuel that was available. Petroleum hadn't really been invented yet. That came a little later. So the Model A, Henry Ford's Model A, ran on alcohol or gasoline. By the time mass-produced cars came out, there was some oil turning into gasoline. And what that was the byproduct of the heating and lighting industry that Rockefeller started. So the stuff that was too volatile to put in oil lamps, because they'd explode and be like Molotov cocktail time, Rockefeller at night would dump into rivers when nobody was looking, basically throwing away all the volatile components of oil because nobody wanted them. Well, figuring out how to make it run in a car meant he got some income from it versus it being a waste product, and being a clever businessman, he made that possible in cities. So he started having places you could buy gasoline in cities. So the Model A ran on both alcohol and gasoline because there was more alcohol available than there was gasoline when the car was first built. If you went out in the countryside from the city and started getting low on fuel, you stopped by almost any farm and you could get distilled liquor, Applejack basically, which you could put in the car. And the Model A was a dual fuel vehicle. You could adjust from one fuel to the other from inside the cab. Didn't have to get out under the hood at all. Anybody here ever have a Model A or a Model T? Okay, so tell me about the choke.
No, it's been a while. The lever on the...
That's the distributor.
Yeah, the advance.
The knob on the dash.
Right.
Well, the knob on the dash, was not truly a choke. What a choke does is it closes a flap that restricts the air coming into what we used to have on cars' carburetors. But this wasn't that at all. This was a long rod that went right down to the carburetor, and you actually adjusted the fuel air mixture with the knob on the dash. So alcohol needed less air than gasoline. So you had to change the air-fuel mixture. And the other thing you did is you adjusted the digital distributor. We had digital distributors back in the early part of the 1900s. It took 5 digits, and you had to go ahead and do it yourself. I jumped ahead a little bit in history from back in the 1910s, the Grangers, and jumped up to there. There's something that happened in the middle. And that was Rockefeller deciding not to compete anymore with alcohol. So he went and found a group that had been around since 1854, I think it was, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. And he went to them with one of his, charity fronts, and he gave them $4 million. And he told them what to do. He said, I want you to make sure that alcohol isn't produced in this country. And they said, that's our mission. Now, imagine 1913, I think it was, at the time when this was going on, 1913 to 15, when all this was happening. You've got an all-male Congress, hard-drinking Congress, and somehow they voted for a constitutional amendment. This is not a normal bill. This is like 2/3 of all of Congress has to vote on this. Not to ban the drinking of alcohol, but the production of alcohol for any purpose. So that became known as Prohibition. And that went on for about 13 years, during which time Rockefeller consolidated his hold on both Europe and America in terms of fuel. He wasn't successful in getting prohibition passed anywhere else in the world, but he tried. And that's all. This is all very well documented. $4 million back at that era would be the equivalent of $60 million today. Can you buy Congress for $60 million? Not a problem. You can even do it today with today's dollars, but you're worthless. So people are asking about, politics. Everything about fuel has to do with politics, and it has to do with who gets the money. And we're going to be talking more about that. But let's kind of move ahead. Let's go ahead and get into the alcohol itself. You know a little bit about the history now. How is alcohol made? Well, it starts with photosynthesis. Plants are unique compared to animals because they can make food from the sun. They take solar energy, mix it with carbon dioxide from the air and water, and that is made into sugar, which is a carbohydrate, right? Carbon dioxide, hydrate, water. So carbohydrates are made by plants using sunlight. So when we ferment carbohydrates, sugar, we feed it to yeast, just like making wine or beer. And the yeast eat the sugar, and they breathe out how to make, because none of the costs of making alcohol went up, so the price stayed pretty much the same. The government did a little bit of controlling of the price. And so people started going up to the pump saying, well, why don't you put some of that and some of this in my car, and let's see what happens. And that's how they discovered that cars would run 50% on alcohol, is by doing what they call rabo de gallo, which is making a cocktail in their tank. So we knew this in the 80s when I was working on alcohol before this was going on in Brazil. At that point, though, in the 80s, I started writing about this, so did a lot of other people. We were saying, hey, 20 years from now, maybe 2003, maybe 2000, we're going to hit the peak of oil. GM is warning Congress, putting in very solemn studies saying, pay attention, we're going to start running out of oil in about 20 years. So everyone knew that we were going to run out of oil. But in 1980, what happened in our government? Well, Ronald Reagan was half of it. What's the other half? George Bush Sr., the father of the current president, for those of you who are too young to know what this era was about. So for 12 years, we had George Bush as president with Ronald Reagan as kind of his talking puppet on the side, So we had the oil companies in charge of the government for 12 years. 2 Reagan and Bush terms, and then Bush and Quayle. So during that time, any mention of alternative fuel basically was laughed at and not funded, and it didn't go anywhere. And we just wasted those 12 years doing nothing. Okay, so you know a little bit about how alcohol is made now. And you know a little bit about how the politics work in multiple countries about it. Let's see. We can talk a little bit about crops that you can use for alcohol. A lot of people complain that making alcohol from corn is not a really good idea, because corn, how's your time there?
We have about 3 minutes, so take a little quick
Why don't we
break.
take a little break before we go into the next session? I've been talking at you for an hour. Let's take 5 minutes and get a breather, hit the head, and come on back, and we'll keep going here. There are a lot of myths out there about alcohol. Some of them are up here. So before I get into different crops that we can use to produce alcohol, I'm going to kind of give you the background of why that's important, because some of the myths are, it takes more energy to make alcohol than you get out. That's a common myth. The other one is, oh no, we don't have enough land. We could never grow enough crops to make alcohol. And the other big myth is, isn't it immoral to grow crops for your SUV and let the starving hordes of Africa starve? In other words, a food versus fuel issue. Those are core propaganda issues about alcohol, and I want to go and make sure I get some of those covered, early on in this thing, and we'll get into some of the practical stuff about crops and as a sideline to that, because it's going to be related. So let's start with the energy balance question. How much energy does it take to make alcohol? If you listen to the popular press, and I think last Sunday there was 3 oil company executives on the air, and they were talking about, oh yes, alcohol takes more oil to make than you get out. Of course you can't make enough. It's basically a hippie thing. And, it doesn't amount to anything. How many people here have heard that it takes more energy to make alcohol than you get out of it? Look at this. Look at this. How many people have heard that? That is an amazing example of the American Petroleum Institute. Because you don't even know where you heard that. But you know it. It's been said so many times that you've internalized it. And you're going to be surprised to learn that all of this information about energy balance comes from one man, David Pimentel. And he's like a perfect front man for the oil companies. David Pimentel, Cornell University. I mean, he's a ecologist, but his actual field is entomology. And he's done brilliant papers on organic agriculture and bug control. But in 1980, he went way outside of his field and did a paper on the energy balance for alcohol fuel. And he did it under the Carter administration just before they were finishing the Energy Research Advisory Board. And the head of this study was himself and Paul Weiss, who was head of research for Mobil Oil. And they were the two guys that were in charge of the study. But what David Pimentel did not tell the Department of Energy is that he was also on the payroll of Mobil Oil when he did the study. And he came out with the conclusion that basically you put in 70% more petroleum energy than you get out as energy in the fuel, and so you might as well, every gallon of alcohol you make just makes the problem worse. Okay, so that's where the myth started. Yeah.
Was that at $1 a gallon or $3 a gallon?
Had nothing to do with price. It had to do with energy. In other words, it took more energy to make it, so it was like basically a scam that farmers were getting away with, yada, yada. And this got repeated over and over and over again. Well, those of you who are old enough might remember Jack Anderson, who was the muckraking reporter from the Washington Post. And he found out that David Pimentel, when he wrote this story, was on the payroll of Mobil Oil. He published that. And then, get this is so priceless. Mobil Oil took out full-page ads in all the big newspapers, chewing out Jack Anderson for daring to question the credibility of David Pimentel simply because he was on the payroll of Mobil Oil. A scientist is a scientist, and they always do the objective thing. And it's like, how stupid do they think we are, So back at that time, George McGovern actually convened a Senate hearing on this finding by the Energy Research Advisory Board, and they basically exposed the whole thing as a scam. What was David Pimentel's solution to the energy problem? We should make fuel from coal. By a process called the Mobil process, which just happened to benefit the people he was working for. So, that was the benefit of the study. Now, ever since then, he periodically publishes re-examinations of his paper. The last two came in 2003 and 2005. And every time he does, the American Petroleum Institute printing presses and now email machine goes into action, and every single press source in the United States gets a copy of the conclusion of this guy's study. So in the scientific community for 20 years, he's been a laughingstock. But the public keeps hearing the conclusions over and over again. And you've seen this already in other fields. For instance, there's 5 scientists that still say that global warming is a theory and that it's not proven. And there's 6,000 that have signed on saying it's definitely real. But whenever there's a newspaper article, they always quote one of the 5 for balance. Okay? Well, whenever you talk about alcohol, they always quote David Pimentel for balance. He's the one. Okay? So I'll give you an example of what's wrong with the study. I'm not going to dwell on him too long because he's such a sad case, but he's done so much damage to the movement. One of the things that Pimentel says that his study is better than other studies about alcohol is that he includes the energy that goes into making the tractor that farms the corn. Now, of course, when you talk about petroleum, does he factor in, tankers and pipelines and all that? No, that's different. But when it comes to farming, he says you've got to figure in the tractor. And he put in this figure, basically, and this figure has hardly changed over 25 years, which is suspicious in itself, that there's 49 pounds of tractor, steel and rubber, per acre that you got to factor in when you make alcohol. Now, if you're an academic, this is just a number, okay? I mean, you don't know what to do with this if you're an academic of the energy field, because he didn't publish any of his assumptions. Like, where did he get this number from? And finally, after 25 years, he finally has been, called out enough times in this that he actually put the assumptions in his 2005 paper, which will be the last paper he ever writes on the subject, especially when my book comes out. So at 49 pounds of tractor per acre, his assumptions finally put in writing were that a tractor has a 10-year life. He certainly isn't a farmer, because the average life of a tractor in the United States is 25.7 years. But let's just go with his 10-year life. And he said it was a 20,000-pound tractor, 10-ton tractor, and it was a 20,000-pound harvester, which of course is only used a few hours a year and on a lot of acreage. So I'm a farmer, and I finally get this data, and I do the math, 49 pounds, 10-year life, 20,000 tractor, and even with his numbers, the farm size comes out to 81 acres. Now, to put that in perspective, the average corn operation in the Midwest is 1,000 acres. But that alone wouldn't damn him, because all the academics who've ever criticized him weren't farmers. They didn't look at this number as anything other than a number. But I'm a farmer. I know what the size tractor this thing is. I can plant 81 acres of corn with this tractor in 4 hours. This is a huge tractor, okay? And so it's a completely bogus number. He's taken a tractor that can actually farm 2,000 acres and attributes all the energy to 81 acres, And of course, if you go ahead and actually put the real life of the tractor, you'd have to make it about 40 acres, because it actually lasts 20 years. And then, nowadays, tractors don't even have tires anymore. They have treads, which use much less rubber, and so basically it gets down to about 30 acres. What it gets down to is that basically he's off by a factor of thousands, 3 orders of magnitude. So that's just one example of what he does. What he did in his studies all this time is, by monkeying with the assumptions, he could make the statistics come out any way he wanted. And nobody in academia had the experience in the field to catch him at it. He must have been laughing for the last 25 years at all these guys. So the other thing that he does is he turns everything into gasoline equivalents. Gasoline equivalents. That means not gasoline, something that's equivalent to gasoline. So you look at the energy that it takes to make alcohol, and right now, the fuel that's used to make alcohol in the United States isn't renewable. It's coal or it's natural gas. And so, yes, those are not renewable fuels, but they're not petroleum. So when he says that it takes 1.5 gallons of gasoline to make a gallon of alcohol, or 1.5 gallons of oil to make a gallon of alcohol, that's not even close. The actual petroleum used, including for pesticides, herbicides, fuel for the field, etc., comes out to 1/6 of the energy that comes out of alcohol. Now, you could say, well, they still got a point. Coal and natural gas are not renewable, so it's not a lot different than petroleum. But petroleum is what's running out. Natural gas is a little bit behind it, but and coal is not going to be running out soon. But even doing this study is completely intellectually dishonest, because corn is a minority crop in the world in the production of alcohol. In other words, most of the alcohol in the world is not made from corn. It's made from sugarcane. The expert on this is Isaias Macedo, and he has done an incredibly exhaustive study this thick, where Pimentel's papers come out, they're 5 pages, where he has gone through and done all the greenhouse gas calculations, taken every bit of steel that is used in an alcohol plant and in farming, takes it all the way back to smelting the ore, and he's really analyzed every bit of energy that goes in such an exhaustive way, in the way that basically Pimentel alleges he's done. And he says with sugarcane, you get 8.3 units of energy out for every energy of unit in. And that's very conservative. I mean, this is assuming you're going back and smelting the ore. In reality, 75% of steel in both Brazil and the United States is recycled. In other words, when something goes to the scrapyard, it doesn't have to be smelted from ore all over again. It takes a tiny amount of energy. The same is true of rubber in the United States. 76% of all tire rubber in the United States is now recycled. So the big energy things that he had in his study turned out to not be true at all because he didn't give any credit to the recycling of the metal at the end. Macedo doesn't either, to be conservative, and he still comes up with 8.3 to 1. This is a pretty damn good energy output. But it's even better than it appears because Macedo, in working with sugarcane, is not saying you get 8.3 units of energy out for a unit of petroleum. He's saying you get 8.3 out for a unit of energy. And where does that energy come from? Well, in Brazil, you crush the sugar cane to get the juice, and that's what you make into sugar or alcohol. But what's left over is the whole sugarcane stalk fiber, and that goes into big boilers, which then produce steam and run the whole plant. All the energy, heating needs of distillation and cooking and everything else comes from burning the plant fiber. That's renewable. I mean, it's essentially like burning wood. It's renewable. It grows every year. They burn enough of it, and they make so much electricity with it that 3/4 of the electricity they make gets put into the grid because they don't even need it in the plant. So, in reality, what you're getting out for energy out, this is a different figure now. Energy out for non-renewables in really is about 500 to 1. Because what you're doing is trapping solar energy, and that's where all this energy comes from. The amount of petroleum used or non-renewables used in the production of alcohol is so small that it's about a 500 to 1 return. Why? Brazilians, they must use fertilizer, right? And fertilizer is made from natural gas. Well, let's talk about this. We've already talked about, and this is going to get us back to corn. And then we'll see how it works with sugarcane. Because we have several questions here we can tie up very neatly with one thing. When you grow corn, you're going to learn some things that they didn't teach you in biology at school. When you grow corn is primarily made of cellulose. Cellulose is plant fiber. Cellulose is made from thousands of sugar molecules linked together. Okay? Starch is 35 sugar molecules linked together, and of course, sugar is produced by itself. So, when you grow corn, for every pound of grain that you harvest from the plant, you get 2.5 pounds of stalk. Now, I'm going to have to do a little segue here about greenhouse gases, because this is part of Macedo's study and part of corn too.
How do you spell his name, please?
Macedo. People in the oil business are fond of saying that alcohol puts out just as much carbon dioxide as gasoline. 20 pounds of carbon dioxide per gallon of fuel goes out the exhaust pipe, whether it's gasoline or alcohol. So they say alcohol is not any good for the environment. But, as you remember from earlier in the talk, this plant takes in carbon dioxide, takes in water, and makes this grain. All right? When we go ahead and make the alcohol from that grain and we put it through the car, the carbon dioxide and water are released back to the air out the exhaust pipe, and the solar energy explodes, and it's what runs your car. So it's CO2 and sunlight. Now, that's just the grain. So if you look at just the grain, it's a perfect loop, right? All the CO2 that went in goes out the exhaust pipe, makes the next crop of grain, you make the next alcohol, it just goes around in a circle. Of course, that doesn't happen with oil. It goes out the exhaust pipe, and there's no absorption mechanism built into the oil system. But wait a minute, we have 2.5 pounds of stalk. And that's made from carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. So basically, when it comes to greenhouse gases, we're taking 3.5 pounds of carbon dioxide out of the air every time we use a pound of grain for alcohol. So we're actually taking more out of the air than we go out the tailpipe of the car. That's still not anywhere close. Because what you weren't taught in school is that for almost every plant and every tree that you see outside this classroom, you only see half of it. The amount of root mass compared to the top mass of a plant, on average, is equal. So here you got 3.5 pounds of roots that are all made of carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water. So now you're up to 3.5 pounds with the roots. So if you add all that up, when you make your alcohol from the pound of grain, you're getting 7 pounds of CO2 impounded. We're not even close to done. The other thing you weren't taught in school, yes?
Doesn't that begin to decompose and give off methane, which is a worse gas than CO2?
He asked, if you didn't hear it, he's saying, doesn't it decompose, make methane, which is a worse greenhouse gas than CO2? No, it would actually decompose to carbon dioxide slowly in the soil if it wasn't first eaten by other organisms and made part of their biomass. So slowly it does, it does first become part of the soil biomass, and some of it does go back to the air. But let me go a little further, because you're going to see we're dwarfing this. Now, everybody in school has been taught this thing about plants, right? Plants have roots, and the roots absorb nutrients and water, which the plant needs, and it goes uphill like this. And if you got a little bit better education, it was explained to you that the way it got up there is that plants have little holes in their leaves, and they evaporate water out, and that creates suction, which pulls the water up. And this is basically how they explain plant biology to you, even to ag students in college. Everything you know is wrong. Because up here, when a plant makes carbohydrates, it pumps sugar down through the roots, out through the roots, and into the soil. Why would it do that? Anybody have a guess?
Feed the microbes.
Very, very good. Feed the microbes. And why is that good? You'll see in a moment. So we've known this for a long time. It was finally proven. Someone actually followed, a molecule of sugar from up here and actually followed the CO2 gas into sugar all the way down. And there's another plant right here. I'm going to back up. I keep backing up because this is very interesting, and you're going to see how it links together. There's a very standard science experiment that every college student sees. And this is about thinking in the box. This is a literal box. This is an actual grow box. And there's a plant here. There's a plant here. Now, this is a growth chamber. Humidity's even. The soil is identical with the two pots of plants. Everything is equal. Because in science, you want to make sure you eliminate the variable so that you can test one single variable and see what the effect is. And so the one variable is that the light is not in the center. It's over here. So as this plant grows and gets bigger, it shades this plant. And eventually this plant gets really big and this plant dies. Okay? And guess what? If you do that experiment again, the same thing happens. And what does that mean in science? It's the truth. If it's repeatable, it must be true. So that's what and this is the basis of the argument, believe it or not, that we're taught in college, that all of us are fighting for scarce resources, and only the strong survive and the weak don't. What's Darwin supposed to have said? Survival of the fittest. Now, this is not corn anymore, this is a tree. So, these students finally wanted to prove that carbon dioxide actually went from here out into the soil. And so they put a bag over one of these branches and squirted in radioactive carbon dioxide gas. So the tree took it up, made it into radioactive sugar. And they had got out their Geiger counter. They started following it. Beep, 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 down the branch. Bop, 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 down the trunk. Boop, 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 out the root. Beep, 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 beep. Out here, into the soil. All right, we've got our doctorate. We finished our paper. Everybody's celebrating. But someone set down the Geiger counter. Beep, 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 boop, 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 bop, 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 bop. All of a sudden, they found the plant next to it was taking up the radioactive sugar. Because the roots of this plant and the roots of that plant, if this is a root hair, this is super microscopic, right? These are cells of the very tip of the root hair. At the very end of these roots, when you have the root hairs, fungus will grow down into the root and punch a hole into the root and grow into the space between the cells, or some funguses will actually punch a hole into the cell and put a bunch of little fungal hairs in there. And this is where the sugar goes. This is one place the sugar goes. It pumps out of the root into this fungus. This fungus is called a mycorrhizal fungus. Myco means fungus, rhiza means root. It's a root fungus. So it turns out that these funguses are all through the soil, and the sugar that is pumped into mycorrhizal fungi here gets pumped up into this poor plant that's in the shade because the fungus decides that it's getting something in trade from this plant that it likes. And so it trades the sugar that it got from the bigger plant for whatever it's little chemical it's getting from this plant. So you can go to the Black Forest in Germany and you'll see wild strawberries growing under pine trees where no direct sunlight ever falls. And scientists have walked by that forever and never, they must have been thinking something like, it's shade tolerant. But they were taught in school that it's not possible. You know, and somehow they just disassociated from that experiment they learned at school and never asked the question, never were curious about how the hell do you get a sweet strawberry when there's no sunlight striking the plant. The answer is, you can't call this a single species. You can't call this a single species. It's like, it's very, what we say, human-centered or anthropomorphic. We're making out like these are all separate things competing for resources. This is not survival of the fittest. This is community. So and this tree cannot survive without these fungi. It needs the fungus to break down rocks and soil and everything else and pump it in, and it trades sugar for it. And the tree's laughing all the way to the back. Oh, God, I can make so much sugar. And the fungus is saying, God, I can dissolve rocks all day. I get all the sweet stuff. And it's trade. Now, survival of the fittest. You know who actually said that? It wasn't Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin never said survival of the fittest. Charles Darwin said, if two organisms compete, nature extincts them both because they're not putting their energy into reproduction. So make love, not war is very important in nature. Okay? Who said survival of the fittest? Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer, a right-wing economist creating a theory called social Darwinism, in which all of us are competing for scarce resources and the poor should die and the rich should ascend. So this social Darwinism is where that phrase comes from, and Darwin never said it. Okay, this is important because here you've got 7 pounds of carbon dioxide apparently just in the roots, the stalk, and the grain. But in reality, 80% of the sugar that the corn stalk makes, the corn plant makes, is exuded into the soil. So it's not 7 pounds, it's more like about 12 pounds. I'm just doing rough math here. Carbon dioxide is taken out for every pound of grain that made a half a pound of alcohol. So when we go ahead and talk about increasing photosynthesis and growing crops for making alcohol, we are talking about reversing global warming. We'll be taking out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sticking it down, trapping it in living things in the soil. Question?
Is this a trickle-down ecosystem then?
Yes, if it's a trickle-down ecosystem theory. I won't even comment on that because I can't do that in polite language.
My question though is, does hemp work better?
You know, that,
Works the best.
I wondered how that didn't get up here, because hemp always gets asked about. I'll touch on that just really briefly. Because it just so happens that a cooperative of hemp growers in Canada are asking me to do something about this. Basically, industrial hemp, you know, the original flag of the United States was a hemp flag. George Washington's big crop was hemp for fiber, for fabric. Hemp has been an industrial plant for a long time, and in fact, when you grow the industrial varieties, which are not, very potent as a drug, they get 14 feet tall, in a very short period of time. That's a lot of biomass. That's a lot of cellulose. It's pretty good, though. There are things that are better. You can get 5 to 8 tons of cellulose per acre from hemp. Now, most of that's too valuable to turn into alcohol because you can turn it into fabric. But there's what are called the hemp herds, which are all the non-fiber cellulosic material in hemp, and that can be made into alcohol. And that's what these hemp growers in Canada want to do, so we're working on that with them. I'll talk more of cellulose in a little bit. Okay, so what we did with this whole description is we talked about how alcohol pulls more carbon dioxide out of the air than it uses in production and actually reverses global warming. And even corn makes sense in terms of a crop for reversing global warming. But there are other crops that are better. I'll just touch on a few of them, although I cover about 40 different crops in the book. But I'm going to give you a couple of interesting ideas to think about.
Is algae pertinent to this conversation?
Yes, algae's coming.
Oh, okay.
I happen to have a very large section of the book on algae because you'll see why. What's the largest irrigated crop in the United States? We have corn, soy. Someone said soy? Cotton? Wheat? Grass clippings! Grass clippings. We produce 3 times as many grass clippings by dry weight as we do irrigated corn. There's over 30 million acres, as far as NASA is able to figure out, of lawn in the United States. It uses more fertilizer than the entire country of India, just fertilizing our lawns. Okay? So, when it gets, we'll talk, I guess we're starting to, I'm going to get back to it because cellulose is kind of a separate case, but basically grass is a cellulose product. But I want you to start thinking that there are things around you going to waste that can be made into alcohol. But we'll talk about crops. Average farm crops, sugar beets. Let me get a different pen here. Sugar beets, you heard me mention that New Zealand and Germany used to grow beets. So sugar beets, which used to be grown in quite a bit in California and in Oregon. And I don't know, are they still grown here?
Yeah.
Or is that's still happening? Good. Sugar beets will give you about 750 gallons per acre. Corn is about 250 gallons per acre. Now, fodder beets, these are the great ones. Fodder beets, these are primarily grown in Europe. They're not used for sugar production because they also produce a little starch, and that makes it so you can't crystallize the sugar out into table sugar. Because sugar beets are used to make table sugar just like you would make it from sugar cane. And fodder beets, on the other hand, these beets, you can't believe how big these beets are. These beets are this tall and this big around, and they weigh 15 pounds each. And they have a lot of carbohydrate in them. And they're much tougher than sugar beets. So you get about 1,000 gallons an acre from them. Okay.
Question. How much do you get out of sugar itself?
Well,
Cane, how much per acre?
cane is about 800 gallons per acre right now. Although you can get more if you do things permaculturally.
Michael Pollan said a few weeks back, or a month before, And one of the things he said when he was speaking was that corn was one of the most efficient plants at uptaking carbon. It would take any isotope of any form. You could put lots of nitrogen on it. It would suck up as much as you gave it. So how does that factor into these other plants?
Well, corn is actually photosynthetically almost as efficient as sugarcane. The theoretical maximum amount of conversion of solar energy to carbohydrates is about 11%. Most land plants are in the 1% to 2% range. Corn and sugarcane are about 2.9%. They're both very efficient converters of solar energy into carbohydrates. But in the case of corn, you get 1 pound of corn and 2.5 pounds of stalk. In the case of sugarcane, you get more easily fermentable sugar and less cellulosic biomass. Now, the difference between corn and sugarcane is that sugarcane is perennial. You plant it once and you harvest it for 10 years. So you don't have to dig up the soil each year, which is the big benefit if you're on sloped ground. So when I went to Brazil last year, I was dreading seeing the sugarcane fields. I was thinking what I was going to see was massive erosion and just disgusting farm practices because, why would I expect anything any different? Do that with corn here, why not sugarcane there? When I got there, I found totally sustainable production, which shocked me. Instead of rows going up and down the hills where water would run down and wash soil away, everything was plowed right on contour. All the sugarcane was planted right on contour. And every so often, as you went down the slope, there'd be a swale like this. All right? So basically, as rain starts running off, it gets here and it fills up, and it soaks in, and it soaks in, and it soaks in. This is a whole discussion in itself about permaculture, but without this kind of structure, only about 1 or 2% of rainfall makes it into the deep ground, 10 or 12% evaporates or is used by plants, and 87% runs off. So when you do this kind of thing, you're capturing most of that 87% and putting it in the ground, where the up to 18-foot deep roots of sugarcane can reach it. Okay? So it's drought-proofing it. So when you do this, you stop the velocity of water, even though each of these sugarcane rows are right on contour at dead level. So I didn't see soil erosion. I saw really good, really well-maintained 10,000-acre stands of sugarcane with no soil erosion. I'll give you a couple other ideas about crops, just for fun. There's, remember the number now, Dave. They all swim around in my head sometimes. In the Southwest, we have what's called a weed tree called mesquite. Mesquite is a nitrogen-fixing tree, meaning that it takes nitrogen from the air, pumps it down through its roots, and gives it to colonies of bacteria that are living on the roots. And they take that nitrogen and turn it into nitrate fertilizer. So nitrogen-fixing plants like beans and peas and trees like this mesquite provide their own nitrogen fertilizer from the air. Now, mesquite is considered a weed in the Southwest. There's about 70 million acres of it. 70 million acres. But the pods, basically giant pea pods you might think of, are full of sugar and easily fermented, and they yield 470 gallons per acre. Now, if you've ever been to the Southwest, it's not like you see vast expanses of mesquite. You see it following the wet spot in the bottom of valleys and stuff. But if you did that swaling technique we're talking about, you could plant a lot of mesquite because mesquite has roots that can go down 150 feet to get to water. It's a very good arid country plant. So here we are getting a yield better than corn without any inputs. No irrigation, no fertilizer. All we have to do is pick the damn pods. Okay? Now, there's so much I want to talk about, and we're just going to run over, but I'll just try to zero in on your questions. Something I'd love to talk about but don't have time is solar saturation. Basically, you saw that corn does what it can, but it reaches a point at which more sunlight does not make more corn and actually stresses it and wastes the sunlight. So many of your crops can be grown under light shade. So, for instance, Mexican corn growing is a corn plant, beans that climb up the corn plant, and squash that's grown under the corn plant field. So what happens is the beans use about 30% of the sunlight and shade the corn. The corn uses about 30% of the sunlight, and they both shade the squash, which uses about 30% of the sunlight. So now you're using 90% of the available sunlight when the average American cornfield only uses 30%, because for reasons don't have time to get into, plants photosaturate. In the middle of the day, they stop making food, unless they have shade. So here we've got these mesquite trees in the desert, making a nice cool microclimate underneath, a nice light shade, So now we can grow crops under here like buffalo gourd underneath, or pomelons. These are similar to gourds. And both of these yield about 400 gallons per acre also, but they can grow underneath the mesquite. So now you're getting 800 gallons per acre, and you haven't used any water yet. Okay? But the other thing about buffalo gourds and pomelons is, the seeds are really oily. So if you press the seeds and make the rest of the pomelon into alcohol, there's enough oil in the seeds for 150% of the energy you need to process the alcohol. You can just use the oil in fuel oil burners. Or you can make biodiesel with it. So I'm just giving you an idea of how we could start to think about energy crops beyond the simple growing of monoculture crops. Okay, I'm going to talk about kelp. You got kelp off the coast here. So do I off California. Kelp is a plant. But what's great about kelp is it doesn't have to stand up. So normal plants have cellulose, which is fibrous. And just like fiberglass is strong because of a combination of fibers and resin, plants have a resin as well called lignin, which saturates the fiber. The lignin's very brittle, just like fiberglass like fiberglass resin would be. And the fibers, of course, are floppy, but very good shear strength, etc. When you mix them together, you got redwood trees. You've got a combination of lignin and cellulose. But water plants don't have to do that. So they don't have to put their energy into making lignin, and they make something called laminarin, which has been used. I found this research on this back in the 1920s, where people were making alcohol out of kelp, and all they did is basically heat it up with some acid, dissolve the laminarin into sugar, and fermented it, and they were getting at least 55 gallons per ton. That's pretty good. So let's talk about how in permaculture we can use this. How many people have heard of the dead zone? Okay, about half of you haven't. The dead zone is a place off of New Orleans where the Mississippi empties into the Gulf with all the fertilizer from all the farms in the Midwest and all the sewage and all the lawns draining into the Mississippi. And that nitrogen goes out and algae just booms, explodes, microscopic algae. And it grows great for a little while, but it has a life cycle and it dies. And when it dies, it uses oxygen to decompose. And it uses all the oxygen in the water for 22,000 square miles. So anything that breathes oxygen, any sea life that breathes oxygen, if it can't swim away from this airless zone, dies. And that's not even the biggest dead zone in the world. There's a 167,000 square mile dead zone in one of the big lakes in the Soviet Union, and there's basically 150 of these dead zones around the world. So the point is we've got nutrient soup. And in permaculture, we always look at that as a surplus. It's not a waste product. It's a surplus that we need to design with. So in China, they always, at the mouths of rivers along the coast, is they grow kelp on nets out here on the surface. And they have a big kelp farm. And they can harvest the kelp. They just keep cutting it. Grows a foot a day. Gets long. They cut it. It grows another foot a day. And it takes those nutrients out of the water. And it makes lots of carbohydrates that you can make into alcohol. So you go, well, this is one of those, crazy dreamer ideas that would never go anywhere, right? Well, American Gas Association. These are the guys who deliver natural gas, right? So they studied off the California coast alone what we could do with kelp to produce energy. They came up with a figure of 24 quads of energy. This is 2 shiploads of energy. This is a lot of energy. Okay, the amount of gasoline that we use in the United States adds up to about 16 quads. So in theory, just growing algae off the coast of California, we could replace all the gasoline. Using kelp. Now, let's do it off of New Orleans. In permaculture, we always try to do things for multiple reasons, called stacking functions. So we go ahead and get the kelp farms going off of New Orleans, and of course, how do carbohydrates get made? There's carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. If sunlight's hitting the water, what is it doing? It's heating it up. But if it hits kelp, it stays cool. So basically, the sunlight is turning into carbohydrates, and it's not heating the water. In fact, the water may be 20 degrees over what it would be during hurricane season. And when a hurricane is heading for New Orleans next time and hits that cold water, it stumbles. Drops down a couple of categories at least before it hits land. So here we can grow kelp out there and hurricane-proof the coast and get rid of the dead zone and make oxygen oases for all the creatures that live in the Gulf, because the kelp is constantly taking in carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen, oxygenating the water.
But you have to keep harvesting that for it to work, right?
No, it'll just keep growing if you don't harvest it. It just gets 150 feet longer.
Why don't you get a dead zone there? Because of the extra nutrients.
The kelp is absorbing the nutrients, and it's producing oxygen, so it's doing multiple functions. And we can produce again most of what we need just from kelp. We haven't gotten the land yet, Okay.
Does that modify the storm surges on stuff too, having all those kelp beds on?
Not too much. It won't do much about storm surge. Yeah. But it will definitely cool the water and turn that energy that was otherwise a problem. I mean, warming the oceans is a bad idea. I could do a whole other thing on that. But basically, what do I want to do? Get some of this covered so I don't keep you guys too late.
How has been fighting? You have this idea. Why hasn't it happened? I mean, who's been fighting?
Oh, it is happening.
Kelp?
Oh, the kelp idea? Well, up until recently, gasoline has been so cheap, natural gas has been so cheap that nobody's been inspired to do anything like this. And of course, it would take somebody with a lot of capital to do this, But they do it in China. They have giant kelp farms in China, So it's totally understood present-day technology that doesn't need any further development and could be deployed immediately. Now, I'm going to have to jump into the byproducts. I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'll continue for those who have time to stay. One of the food versus fuel issues is, of course, we can't grow all this corn for our cars because we'd starve people in Africa. So out of the corn we grow, about 70% of it goes to cattle and other animals in the United States. Another 17% of it is exported, actually it's a little more than 17%, is exported to Africa? Mexico? No, Europe, to feed rich people's cattle. So 87% of the corn is animal feed. So, I'm a vegetarian. I would say that's not food, but you might have a different opinion, meat being food. So we'll give you the benefit of the doubt here that, there's an issue here about food. What if we diverted all this corn that was going to the cattle? Will we have less meat? Well, in permaculture, we always go back to where things started. And if you go back to where cattle come from, they come from the forests of southern Europe and formerly northern Africa. We have a desert there now in northern Africa that was caused by overgrazing. It's called the Sahara. So cattle have big, wide feet. They're good on soft forest soil. And they have 4 stomachs. Bison have cloven hooves. They're really good for the prairie. They can eat grass. But cattle eat shrubs. Cattle have no acid in their stomach whatsoever. It's pH 7. It's neutral. Our stomach acid's around pH 2. We can dissolve starch like that. So cattle cannot use starch. They don't eat grass normally in nature. We're making them eat grass and the seeds of grass because that's the way our agriculture has organized itself. But over 85% of the starch in corn goes through cows undigested. Why do we feed corn to cattle? Because of protein and fat. And we can store it a long time, and we can feed it in feedlots. If we're a corporation and don't have a lot of land, we can buy the corn off the farmers for almost nothing, and then feed the cattle in our feedlots. And it's really convenient, but it's very wasteful. Now, we can redesign this system. And in fact, it's already been done. We just have to do more of it. When you produce alcohol, what are we producing alcohol from again? No. Basic material. Carbohydrates, which is starch. So if we take the corn and we first make alcohol, we get two byproducts. One is carbon dioxide, which, by the way, a lot of the carbon dioxide in this country used in industry and in your sodas and stuff is made by burning natural gas. Because natural gas is CH4, so when you burn it, basically you get CO2 and some water. So that's how they make carbon dioxide for industry. So we make a lot of carbon dioxide that could replace natural gas. We also get a byproduct called dried distillers, grains, and solubles from corn. This is the mash leftover from making corn. Now, back in the old days when the revenuers were trying to find who was making moonshine, they'd just go to the county fair. Oh, fattest hogs, we're going to his farm tomorrow because this is really great animal feed. Why? It becomes a protected protein in the process of being fermented, and the starch is removed, which is in the way of absorbing the protein and fat in a cow's stomach. So if you take basically 100 pounds of corn, it has about 33 pounds of dried distillers grains as a result, and the rest of it, became alcohol and CO2. If we feed the 33 pounds of dried distillers grains to the cattle instead of the 100 pounds of corn, they gain 17% more weight, 30% faster. So you need to turn the food versus fuel thing on its head. It's immoral to not ferment our corn because it decreases the amount of food. So we could take the extra corn and feed everyone in the world with it, the 17% we now don't eat.
But they don't want our altered corn.
Well, they don't want our GM corn, and I don't blame them, But the point is, it's not a food versus fuel issue. It's a food and fuel issue, and we get both. We don't give up anything here. Now,
What about the water?
water can be reused in an alcohol plant several times before it has to go off to something else. In other words, you can take the mash, which is sterile, and you can use it for the next batch 3 or 4 times before you have to run it out. In Archer Daniels Midland plant, 200 million gallon per year plant, they have no sewer. There is no waste. The only way water leaves the plant is from the cooling towers, where some of it evaporates to cool it so they can use it for other functions. No sewer. 200 million gallons per year. They have a small sewage treatment plant for the people who work there. They have to process their sewage. But nothing from the alcohol plant ends up in the environment. It is all made profit from. And that's them. We can do a much better job.
Dave?
Yes. Well, okay, the price of gasoline has nothing to do with the price of a barrel of oil. Nothing whatsoever. Because if you take a look at what comes out of a barrel of oil, and I'm telling you this is a 1980 figure, it's much more now. In 1980, a barrel of oil generated $25,000 worth of products, nylons, pesticides, various plastics, industrial chemicals. And that was about 15% or so of the oil went to that. The rest of the oil is thrown away. It becomes toxic waste. And we pay for the privilege of getting rid of their toxic waste because whatever's left over from making more valuable things from oil ends up in the gasoline. There are over 400 different things on a given day that get dumped into gasoline, and no 2 days are alike, depending on what they're making in the refinery. And we pay to get rid of the toxic waste. So the money the oil companies make, because they're oil companies, is from all those other products. Pesticides cost $80 a pound. The oil costs almost nothing per pound in comparison to that. So there's no reason to charge us full freight for fuel except for green, because the money they're making on the, all the important, so-called important stuff, really pays the whole freight. And just like Rockefeller dumping that gasoline in the rivers at night, they've just arranged to neatly package it up there for us and tell us how it's so special, and they make it just for us, and it's just right, and it's better than everyone else's, and it's just toxic waste. And it's carcinogenic, it's mutagenic, it's tetragenic, which means it damages fetuses. It's horrible stuff. The stuff that's in gasoline is banned in industry. Benzene. Benzene, you can't use that anywhere nowadays. Yet it's permitted to be up to 30% of gasoline. Garbage byproduct. Totally carcinogenic. Two-strokes. You burn that stuff in a two-stroke engine. The difference between a four-stroke and a two-stroke is that in a four-stroke, the basic cycle is the piston goes down, it sucks in air and fuel, it goes up and compresses it, the spark plug fires, it drives the piston down, that's the third stroke, right? One stroke, one stroke, two strokes, three strokes goes down, and then it pushes on the fourth stroke, pushes the exhaust out. With two strokes, it's down and up, which means that the intake and exhaust valves are open at the same time for a brief time, and unburned fuel goes out the exhaust. Benzene, toluene, and xylene are up to 40% of gasoline, and it goes out of the exhaust. Severe carcinogens. So two-strokes can run on alcohol just fine. There's special two-stroke oils that mix with alcohol that you can that do the lubrication, because in two strokes you have to put the lubricant in the fuel. I have used biodiesel as a lubricant with alcohol at rates of 75 and 100 to 1. 1 part biodiesel, 75 or 100 parts alcohol. No wear. Runs just fine. Biodiesel is a very good lubricant. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story. I wrote this book back in the early 80s. I've been going around the country. I had way too much adrenaline and way too much youth, and I just threw myself at this thing. And for 3 years, I taught 180 workshops around the United States. I appeared over 750 times in radio, television, and newspapers to promote those workshops. And PBS said, wow, this is really cool. People really like this subject. We want to make a series of how to make alcohol with you and sell a book about it at the end. This was a new idea at the time. Only one book had ever been sold on PBS before, and that was Yan Can Cook, about Chinese cooking. So this was the second book. And so we spent 2 years working on this book. I went 1,500 miles all over the Pacific Northwest and California to visit my students and others who were making alcohol as a result of my classes. And we got all their stories, we filmed all their operations, and we did a condensed version of my 8-hour workshop, which was all how-to, not all this stuff, it was strictly how-to, that I've been teaching for a couple of years. And it came out to be a 10-part series, 10 half-hour shows. And I was right here in this town, because back then, the Oregonian, as a sideline, used to print books, and they gave me the best bid. So I was up here in Portland. The series had been on the air for two or three segments by then. We had 5,000 orders from 3 segments in San Francisco, just in San Francisco. And I'm up there, we're working on getting back then it was not desktop publishing, it was a whole process to making a book. And they get a call and they say, send our check back to the TV station that had paid for all this. And I get back and I see that the remaining show segments have the book advertisement taken off the end. And that the 120 PBS stations that had signed up to air the show after its premiere in San Francisco were denied the series. They weren't allowed to have it. And I after weeks, finally got through to one of the board members of KQED. And he said, well, it's really simple, Dave. We get lots of money from Chevron now. And they called up Tony, the director, and said, what's wrong? You don't like our money? And that's all it took, one phone call. If this book would have come out in 1983 like it was scheduled to, we would not have been in Gulf War I. We wouldn't be in Iraq today. We wouldn't need any of that oil. We just wouldn't need it. And we would have tens of millions of jobs in the United States in rural areas where they're needed, making fuel for this country. And, I got to tell you, even though I'm telling my own story, I'm going to tell you a quick aside. We've spent $320 billion already in Iraq. We use 160 billion gallons of alcohol a year, gasoline a year. It costs $1 per gallon of capacity to build alcohol plants. So for $160 billion, we can build enough plants to make all the alcohol we need to replace all the gasoline, with half of what we've already spent in Iraq. And it never would stop. We'd keep producing year after year. If you look at the U.S. military budget, it's $500 billion a year. That we know about. Well, it might be $1 trillion, but the published figure is $500 billion. The world uses 500 billion gallons of fuel a year. If we just decided to shut down the war machine for 1 year and took that money and built alcohol plants in every country that were producing all the food that anybody would ever need, what would there be left to fight over? 1 year. That's all it would take. It's not going to happen. We have to do it. Okay? We can do it. There's nothing about this that's rocket science. This is moonshining. This is mankind's second oldest profession. We can do this. Cars are already sold by Detroit that run on alcohol or gas or any mixture. We didn't get into conversion, but any gasoline car can be converted to run on alcohol for a few $100s. We can do this.
So are you allowed to make alcohol in big quantities?
You're allowed to make up to 5,000 gallons on a free permit for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, but several of you can share the same still and each have your own permit.
So we could do this on neighborhood level and have farmers doing CSAs, growing fuel, and
The concept we're promoting in the book, because I was a CSA farmer for 10 years, everybody know what that is? A CSA farmer takes subscriptions. Instead of borrowing money from the bank to pay for all the inputs, grow the crop, deliver it to a terminal, and wait 60 days to get paid by the corporation, a CSA farmer contracts with a group of people to provide their food. And each one of them pays in advance for their food, which is when the farmer needs the money. And through the year, they get a box of food every week from the farm. And in this way, farmers are getting full retail with no middlemen, and they can make a living doing this on small acreage. And I fed 450 people in 150 shares, 150 boxes every week, 48 weeks a year in California because we have a short winter. Piece of cake, made plenty of money. The average corn farmer makes $50 an acre. I made $100,000 on 2 acres. So I think when it comes to farming, I have some room to talk. So the point is, if we do community-supported energy, and we have obviously opportunity to do community-supported other kinds of food than vegetables here, we can just transform the system. So if a bunch of you got together and contracted with a farmer that had some acreage to grow your sugar beets and make your alcohol, and delivered it to a station in town that you could all fill up at, this is not complicated. This is all doable, and it's all in the new book. So I want to say a little bit about this. The book that I've been working on for 3 years, it's just kind of amazing that alcohol is being talked about right when my book's coming out. I think, my guardian angel is working with me here. But basically, the whole book was completely rewritten. It cost over $250,000 to do it. We had a staff of 4 people working on research, and I traveled around the world to do it. And the new book explores this model on several levels. And of course details everything that we've been talking about tonight and far more about conversion and everything else. The whole project has been done without taking any corporate money. And we've taken no foundation money and no alcohol industry money. This whole project has been funded. Thank you. This whole project has been funded by individuals, about 30 people, who've put up money, loans for this project, which they'll get repaid out of the book sales, and we have to sell about $7,500 to pay back the lenders, which I don't know, if we're talking about making alcohol for 43 cents a gallon, I don't think we're out of trouble selling 7,500 bucks. So we now have enough money. We had a publisher, progressive publisher, thought we were all set. And as we got to editing, the publisher started saying, no, that's too controversial, that's too controversial. And so we said, we're not going down this road again. We did this with KQED, we're not doing it. So we're having to self-publish it. It's already through editing now. In the next week, goes to layout, proofreading, indexing, and then printing, hopefully by September. And we don't have the print budget yet. We still need to raise $20,000 to print the first 3,000 books. It's about $6 to print the 550-page book that it'll be. So if any of you are interested or know someone who would be interested in becoming part of our group of lenders to make this thing get out on time in September, please get a hold of me. I'm farmerdave@permaculture.com if you want to write to me. And with that, I got to tell you one thing. You are not innocent anymore. You now know what to do. And all you need to do is to get organized. So Portland Peak Oil is a great place to start organizing to get your first station going, buying alcohol from co-op producers in the Midwest that are producing 100 million gallons per year, and then work on getting a local farmer to produce your fuel. But start with converting your cars and getting your alcohol purchased, which you can do right now. You know,
converting the car, do you need a new carburetor, or can you use your real carburetor if your carburetor is injured?
You can just alter your carburetor. All the instructions are in the book.
Cool.
So everything you'll need is in the book starting in September. But you can get started right now organizing yourself. You don't have to wait. So you can't say in the future, oh, woe is me, the government's raising, going to war and it's raising the gas prices and isn't it terrible? You don't have talking room anymore. You now know what an answer is and you can do something about it. So I can only do what I can do. I know what my assignment is. My assignment was to write the book and go around telling people about this. But it's up to you to go ahead and start replacing petroleum in your community. In Wisconsin, every dollar spent on gasoline, all but 12 cents leaves the state the next day for a transnational corporation. The alcohol that's sold in that state, by the way, there are 600 alcohol stations in the United States, mostly in the Midwest. When alcohol is sold for fuel, 67% of the money stays in the state and is spent over and over again by the people in that state, generating far more tax benefits than the few subsidies you get. Oh, I didn't tell you about that. When you make your own alcohol for $1 a gallon, you get to take 61 cents a gallon off your taxes for every gallon you produce. It's a credit, not a deduction. Deduction comes off your income, credits come off your tax. So you can make it for $1 a gallon, but you really only end up paying 40 cents. So anyway, I'll stick around. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then I'll stick around.
Are there any stations in the Portland area, or?
There are no stations I know about yet in Oregon, but the state is working on making that more possible. But any place with a good parking lot, for instance, in permaculture, we're always looking at cycles, and there's a really great parking lot that every community has that's available 6.5 days a week at your local church. And so you can do an above ground station, which will cost you less than $50,000 to get installed. So like $300 or $400 a person for 200 or 300 people. You own the station. Do it at no excess profit because you wouldn't be charging yourself extra profit. You pay someone to manage it, a reasonable salary. Let's say the median salary of everybody who's, part of that station, and you convert your cars. You can do it right now.
Do you talk about genetically engineered food in your book at all?
Yes.
And can we buy your book just now, and then when you finally get it published, pre-purchased?
There are two things you can do about the book. You can go to my website. You can become a member of Alcoholics Unanimous. And that will get you a copy of the book when it comes out. Or you can make sure you sign up on that list over there that we make sure you get on the mailing list. Or if you don't want to buy the book now but you want to be notified, you can just go onto the website at permaculture.com, and when you get into the alcohol part, just go to Get Involved, and there's a place where you can just sign into the mailing list, and you'll be told about the pre-publication deal that will be available like 30 days before the book comes out, so you'll get a little benefit for being the first buyers.
What's your, are you a nonprofit? Are you for-profit?
Both. I have a nonprofit and a profit-making entity because you don't need any tax credits when you're a nonprofit. So, it serves to do both. And in fact, your station should be a profit-making entity, an LLC, and I explain all that in the book. One last question.
What's the name of the book and how much will it cost?
Alcohol can be a gas. Fueling a revolution.